Okay, so now that we've convinced everyone to have a data availability statement for their journals, I do have a few questions that I have queued up. That was fantastic, everyone. Thank you again so much. Not a single mention of ChatGPT, so a little bit of a change. So this question, this first one that I'm going to use to kick off, actually came from a conversation I was having with Sonia in preparation for the panel. And it is decidedly not a softball question. We don't encourage softball questions in this panel. So it has to do around the cost of open data. A lot of the conversations that we were having today have recognized the benefits of open data, both from an altruistic standpoint, furthering science, making it move further and faster. But there are some realities around that. So one of the things that I would like to start off in asking the panel is how can we ensure that data sharing practices are accessible and equitable for researchers across diverse fields, institutions, and geographic regions? And with the costs of open science in mind, what should funders and publishers be considering in promoting open data policies?
I don't know necessarily the answer to this question, but I think about this a lot. That's why I asked Dan to ask it, because I actually want to know what publishers think about this. Because as a funder, I recognize that the cost is not cheap, and we're doing this, for altruistic reasons. But if we want to scale, you have to be pragmatic. So I would divide it into two ways. So one is there is access in terms of training and education, and it is very hard to do that if there aren't standards. And so the first easy step is just to create those standards. And then when we think from a cost perspective as a funder, I can make the case to fund a pool of collective action rather than going and doing multiple one-offs. And I think that that will make it cheaper. And so from a pragmatic perspective, that's why my call to action was all about how can we collectively do something, because then we can pool our funding efforts in this pre-competitive space to make it a little bit more equitable.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add from the NIH perspective, we have a lot of experience with data sharing and supporting data sharing over time, and it can sort of require significant resources, and I think we've actually spent significant resources on data sharing, not just in the sense of supporting it by having our actual researchers do it, but also by providing infrastructure and tools and things like that over many years. But as we expand these policies out to cover essentially 100% of the research portfolio, one thing I think we do want to do is to understand the costs and the needs better than we do currently. And so, we're hoping to learn more, especially from the first couple of years of this. One of the things we've done is to clarify that we really do want people to indicate, the costs of data management and sharing in their budget requests. And we said that those are allowable direct costs. I think this may not have always been as clear in the past, although I also think that researchers have simply done it without even thinking about whether who is paying for it exactly. So we're hoping, I think, to see some better sort of accounting in the future, and then can make kind of more informed choices about guidance as well. And when it comes to the issue of standards, I think is also actually a really important question for costs, because standards will help you determine sort of what is the most optimal thing for a community to share. In the genomics field, this is, I think, pretty well resolved. But it wasn't always that way in the beginning in terms of what specific data types should be shared. I think other fields sort of need to still arrive at that. And so that is something that I think will help to understand what is the appropriate cost for sharing data for different sort of sectors, because I do expect that it's going to be actually substantially different.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the whole answer, but I think it's one piece of the puzzle is just understanding these differential rates of adoption across communities, right? And so, yeah, I think that part of what has motivated this Open Science Educators project at PLOS has been, yeah, being able to show those differences in a way that's actionable. And so, yeah, I think it's been encouraging for us to see conversations with funders, with sort of national level research organizations, where, again, without this sort of naming and shaming approach at all, but just saying, yeah, that if adoption is lower in certain sort of segments or sort of communities, again, I think that's a starting point to say what forms of support are needed to sort of achieve equity.
I mean, I'll just, agree with everything that's been said, but to clarify, I mean, I think it's going to cost us all, right? It's going to cost funders, it's going to cost publishers, it's going to cost authors, right, in the sense of their grant money. But I think there has to, like everything, if we all want to achieve that same goal, we have a higher chance of being equitable if we cover a lot of ground. So, NIH fundees will have built in this capacity to create a plan, to ask for funds for the plan and create that trajectory. A lot of communities are not going to have that for a while. So, having a solution at the publisher level that is generic and that is simple will suffice for a while for those communities until there is the perfect repository that's, is ideally suited for that data set. So I think I think going for perfect will really harm us right now if we want to have the perfect standards and the perfect repository for every data set available to everybody. I think trying to cover as much ground as we can and assuming that everybody is going to have to put some cost up front for this.
Yeah, maybe I want to address it a bit more broad. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about ChatGPT, but I think the challenge is energy in general. So how can we convince authors to put extra energy? We had a researcher yesterday who talked about, oh, I have to fill in these forms, I have to do this data management plan, etc. The same with publishers. How can we make sure that setting up the policies is important, and how do you deal with the priorities? So I think we have to communicate that the research data is going to be equally important as the manuscripts. So we have to make it a fully recognized research output. Only then can we motivate people to make their plans, to store the data, to share the data. So making sure that research data is fully recognized, it's cited, etc. I think that is the way whereby we can motivate the researchers in investing costs, let's say, in the broadest sense.
Yeah, you stole my second question. Because every year we run a survey of researchers called the State of Open Data, and one of the findings from this year was around this idea that enthusiasm for sharing data is dropping, and one of our hypotheses is maybe it's because of all the requirements. So it's how do we keep that inertia, less with compliance, but more with sharing the benefits and helping researchers to really think and authors to think about this as they're generating the data. I don't know if anyone wants to have any comment on that, or I can jump to a next question.
So we've thought about that a little bit too, and I think that we just have to acknowledge there's a new workforce that needs to enter the market that specializes in curation of data, and we need to just think from who's actually doing it, because it is not the investigator of the lab, it is the trainee that is probably doing this curation, and they need to have support for that. And so I just think that that is a reality we have to live with and think about how do we adjust to that new ecosystem.
Yeah, I think I would just add really quickly that, having talked about this policy during very early stages of it and given webinars on it and things like that to many, many people, I would say that I think the assumption that everybody is on board with the value of, data sharing, don't be surprised when talking with different communities if you find that might not always in every local situation be true. So I think there is, a major kind of theme of the data management and sharing policy, which is sort of wanting to lead cultural change. And I think we recognize we can't really get there without some rules. And just, necessarily when you're promulgating rules, people aren't always going to be happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a lot the reward system that is missing, and it is, right? It still is. It's researchers are not getting grants or tenure positions because they've shared data. So until they see clearly that that's sort of the case, it's going to be much harder.
A lot of the presentations today talks about the need for data availability statements, having journals adopt that, having publishers adopt that, and tracking that. But one of the things that also comes up when you are publishing data is this idea of integrity. So I was wondering how, we did, I think Erica, you just mentioned this idea of it trying to keep, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So when we're thinking about integrity of data, what measures do you think we should take to measure the quality of the data that's being shared alongside the journal article?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and that's why we're also investigating, let's say, the quality aspect of research data. Let's not just encourage people to share the data, but good data. So we published a white paper in December of last year looking at research quality and thinking about how can we apply the processes and the frameworks we have for our manuscripts, so apply that to data. Peer review is a sensitive topic for research data, and I think we can't ask our reviewers to check the data alongside the manuscript. That's too much work. But I think here automation can really help us.
Yeah, a couple things that I would mention. I mean, one, I think this is a place where actually there is a role for these more specialized repositories where they're available, and we know that they're sort of distributed unevenly at the moment. But yeah, I would say that that work of curation can be done sort of in partnership with repositories that are really sort of rooted in research communities and are serving the particular needs of those communities who therefore have a stake in that being done and done well. So yeah, I think that's not a solution for every data set, but I think that where it's available, that's a good solution. The other thing that we're starting to think about at PLOS is really around surfacing reuse and measuring reuse as well as measuring sharing, right? That's sort of been our focus so far. And I think that when you measure reuse, that doesn't mean that the data was always good, right? But I think that it is one indication that other researchers found it valuable, right? And so I want to be cautious about assuming that, in the same way that we would be cautious about just because a paper is highly cited means that it's a high quality paper. We know that that's not the case. But I think, yeah, looking at reuse is important from an impact perspective, but I actually think it's also important from a quality perspective. It's one trust marker, to sort of use this language again, that can be looked at in conjunction with other things to say, this is a data set that's been found to be valuable by the community.